here from Scott Jenson, and it is How Can GNOME Explore Bigger Concepts? Go ahead, Scott.
Hey there. So I can just start. I'm going to mute my computer because I'm getting a weird feedback loop. Okay, I'm going to start projecting, and I've got 25 minutes, so I'm going to have to move pretty quickly. So let's get started. Okay. I wanted to, first of all, can I just get a thumbs up from somebody that my screen was projecting okay? Could you see it all right? Good, thank you. Appreciate the thumbs up. That was very helpful. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. The problem is that once I get into full screen mode, I can't see a damn thing. So if you guys need to talk to me, you're gonna have to need to call me or something. It feels a little weird to kind of disappear for 20 minutes. So I'm gonna give it the best shot I can here. Okay, so how can GNOME explore new concepts? I've actually spoken about UX in open source for several years now, mostly at FOSS Backstage. And this is my first time at GNOME, so I'm really excited to be here. But I realized that when I wrote this title, it was a little vague. What I was referring to is effectively desktop UX. And I mean it in the broadest sense. We've got, at the bottom level, we've got keyboard and mice and displays. Then we've got kind of our software tools like windows and menus and files. And then there's actually with the user tasks of things like text editing and direct manipulation. And this has kind of been like this holy grouping of how we wanted to think about desktop UX. But I'm not specifically talking about all of the deep and significant work like the GNOME team is doing, like on the shell, for example, and bugs and incremental features and polish and visual design. I mean, there's a tons of deep and important work that needs to get done there. I don't want it all to not acknowledge that work is being done. But that's not really the focus of this talk. I'm focusing more on effectively new models, new technologies, new ways of doing things. And because historically, I think a lot of times what we would do is we basically copy what the other bigger guys are doing, and we've kind of fast follow behind them. And when I say that, people often get a little testy. And I don't think they appreciate that I mean that as a compliment, because most UX progress comes from good copying. It's not a bad thing at all to copy. And what I mean by this is that quote from Pablo Picasso that good artists copy and great ones steal. And I don't think people really appreciate this quote. It was really used an awful lot by this guy. And he used it in a way that I think is pretty subtle. And I think we should talk about it because good artists naively copy. And they just kind of copy as best they can. They don't really do the full thing. They don't really understand exactly what they're copying. But great ones creatively steal. They kind of make it their own. Because the history of the desktop UI is big and long, but a lot of it started with the Xerox Star, and pretty much people agree that Macintosh stole it, but it was a very creative stealing, right? They realized they didn't want to use a 2-button mouse, they wanted to use a 1-button mouse. They didn't want to use their Windows, they had a different kind of window, and so forth. Whereas Windows, I would say, is a little bit more of a naive copy, and it was for quite a while. I am not going to make any comments about what GNOME was because I just don't know GNOME's history. So I want to be very careful about what I say there. But the point isn't that it was a one-to-one, left to right steal all the way across. Because, of course, once we started getting things running and working more, it kind of echoed back. And so a lot of things from GNOME went into Windows and Macintosh. Macintosh stole from Windows. So everybody is frankly copying from everybody else. I guess I'm trying to make two separate points here. One is a naive copy is far less valuable than a creative copy because naive copies are usually kind of done poorly, right? And the second point is we're running out of stuff to copy. And I think that is a much more fundamental point because it was quite reasonable for us to let, say, Microsoft or Apple do something first and try it and let them make the mistakes. And they had the big research budgets. That's perfectly fine. But they're stopping right now. And so our assumption, though, is that there has been this slow, steady growth, and we've reached this maximum nirvana, desktop is as good as it's ever going to get. We can relax now. And I'm like, no, that's not it at all. I actually think that we're at a local maximum, and there's something much, much better for us to target towards. And it's just hard for us to kind of see the future. This a belief in that we are at a maximum is preventing us from seeing the future. And as I said before, these guys are not exactly leading the way. They're making an awful lot of mistakes right now. And I think it's important for us to kind of talk briefly about that. Apple has mostly, frankly, I would argue, given up on Mac OS. I mean, they're really leaning into their continuity features like screen sharing and notification and universal clipboard, which is fine, but that's an ecosystem play. They just want you to use their devices together. They're not really changing the desktop UX. Other things like they actually went backwards with settings to copy iOS, or they used Stage Manager for their window manager. They're basically saying the future is the iOS and the desktop is this little thing on the side, and we're just going to try to unify them as much as possible. So my point is that Apple really doesn't really want to evolve the desktop UX very much. Windows is just making one mistake after another. It's so frustrating. I mean, these incredibly thirsty OneDrive and Edge signups are making us all frustrated. The latest recall disaster, which recall was actually, I think, a very interesting UX concept, but the way it was implemented caused a lot of problems. I have a personal story. I actually interviewed there to be head of UX for Windows about 7 years ago. And I flew up there, and if you want to go for a job like this, you have to come in with an attitude, right? So I came in, or a position, and I came in with the position I've been telling you now, that desktop had pretty much stabilized and it needed to really go in new ways. Needless to say, they didn't like that, so I didn't get the job, and I think I kind of dodged a bullet because Windows 11, frankly, isn't that much different than Windows 10. And now in the short term, I think people are pretty excited by this because this is driving people away from Windows. Linux desktop usage is up significantly, apparently like 33% in the last year or so. So yeah, in the short term, we're great. This is fun, but I think there's much a bigger long-term risk, because we were using these guys as our research labs. They were doing this stuff, making mistakes, being the canary in the coal mine, and we would steal from them. And I mean that in a good way, and I don't think we're going to be able to do that much more. So we can think bigger thoughts. And I want to make sure I'm really clear here because I'm fairly new to GNOME. There are a lot of people in GNOME thinking bigger thoughts. I'm not trying to say that nobody is doing that. All I'm saying is we need more of it. And how do we do that? And when I've talked to people that were working on more forward-thinking projects, they were saying, I'd love to do it more, but I can't. I have other things to do, and I have my real job. And so there's lots of constraints that are basically holding us back. But our goals and our architecture are fundamentally different from these companies, for-profit companies. And we can do things that they would never dare with open APIs and much more forking ability to do more experiments. So I believe that we can actually not only do these things, but have a kind of an exponential growth. The more things we try, the more experimentation that we can do. But every new direction feels risky. So if we're at a local maximum, no matter where you go off the hill, it's a step downwards. And so that just feels really weird. So it's hard to talk about the future. And whenever I talk about this online, mostly on Mastodon, I get a lot of kind of pushback on it. But this is not something that's unique to open source or Linux or even GNOME. Reasoning about the future is hard for anybody. And it's particularly tough, I think, with the Linux GNOME community because everyone is understaffed and underfunded. So it's a challenge to do that. We had a running joke when I was at Frog Design. I was creative director at Frog Design in San Francisco. And we weren't in the design business. We were in the design therapy business. We would work with these companies. And, Frog wasn't cheap. And we would do all these workshops and come up with all these really innovative ideas. And they loved it, absolutely loved it. And they would go back to their companies and they would drop almost all of it on the floor. And it's really hard to move from idea to execution. And we really had to work with people to talk about it, to work with our teams, to kind of get it out the door. So what does it take to explore the future? Well, I think there's three key points. And this is the backbone of my talk. We want to avoid framing traps. We want to talk about possible directions that we can explore. And of course, we have to talk about the nitty-gritty of how we ever make this happen, given where we are with funding and people. So the three traps, and I see this a lot on social media. I haven't talked enough to people in the GNOME community, so this is a very broad statement here. I'm not targeting any community on this one, but to say that there's this thing called constraint thinking, making it pretty, and it's a standard. And I think all three of these are kind of slowing us down. So the first trap is constraint thinking. About a week and a half ago, I had this great thread, lots of people chiming in about drag and drop and why it really wasn't working in Linux. And by drag, I mean, sure, drag and drop works, but if I wanted to drag this happy.gif file in the background window from the Finder, into my mail client, it's pretty straightforward, right? What I just simply do is I just go over, I click on it, it highlights, I drag it in, and I'm done. It seems pretty obvious. This is basically impossible on Linux because the way of clicking on that window, basically it brings the window forward. I think you guys call it raising, and it raises it so that if that window is big enough, it means it obscures my target. And it was a big conversation on Mastodon. And it turns out, apparently, that this is an X11 Wayland limitation. And due to something about networking latency issues, that only the click is passed, not the mouse down and the mouse up. That is probably true. I can't speak to that. But the argument was like, oh, that's hard. That to fix that, to make it be mouse down is way, way too hard. And therefore, they came to the conclusion, well, this is not worth it to fix. And that's what I mean by constraint-based thinking. You take a look at the issue, you immediately give it a technical judgment, and then you shut down any conversation about this. And what we did at Frog to do this is we called pretend it's magic. Basically relax your constraints. Think a little bit more creatively. If you have 3 or 4 ideas, then talk about them and pretend that they were possible. And if they were possible, what would you do with them? And so instead of exploring the constraints, you explore the benefit. And you talk about which ones are more important, which ones are less important. And usually of your 3 or 4 ideas, one becomes really exciting. And then not only that, and you find the core value, but more importantly, you find out exactly how it can be used. Because once you know what you really want, you can kind of revisit the constraint and realize that you don't need to boil the ocean and do the whole thing. You can do a much smaller thing that actually is possible to do. So the idea here is that goals melt constraints, and they help you actually understand that you don't need to do too much, because the natural assumption is that you have to fix everything. You don't have to do that. The second one is a lot of UX designers see this and make it pretty. And I even heard this in a talk yesterday when they talked about that one new product, that they've really improved the UX and it's really pretty. And if you really want to make a UX designer die inside, just say that you want them to make something pretty. It's guaranteed to get their back up. Because Windows 10 and Windows 11 look different, but I would argue in many ways they're nearly identical in how the user has to open their apps and move around and access things and use their windows and use the files. I mean, the basic structure is the same, they've just changed things. And so there's a big difference between UI and UX. Really, UI is about making it pretty. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's powerful things that you can do to do things through pixels and pretty. But UX is about progress. How you make progress through your application or your operating system. And it's that flow. So the example I wanted to give is iPad screen sharing. So here's my desk where I'm at right now. And here's a picture of me working on this very slide. And I had heard that you could share your iPad wirelessly as a screen. So I set it up there on the right-hand side. I went into the control panel, clicked on screen mirroring, and just there it was. I didn't have to do anything. I just clicked on it and it just showed up. And not only that, it was shockingly responsive and low latency. It was like really a great monitor. I probably wouldn't do gaming on it, but it was really, really good for text editing. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that, and by the way, if you don't like Apple or if you don't like this particular feature, I don't care. That's not the point here. The point here is to show you what I mean by UX. And what Apple did in this particular case was they really sweated the details on the lower level APIs and how they were able to rendezvous and to find these things and how to share their screens effectively, so that all I had to do was click twice and it just worked. And so the point I'm trying to make is that great APIs unlock great UX. And too often, the development happens and then the UX happens at the end, and all you can do is UI hacks. Oh, we have an error situation here. Write a dialog box to make the user feel better about this error. Well, that's not usually. It's much better to have the APIs fixed up front, and that makes things a whole lot better. No, I understand. There's a time and place for this. You can't always do it. I'm just making the point that UX prefers to be on the left-hand side. So good APIs melt UX complexity. And the last one is saying it's a standard, which I've heard practically every month of my life for 30 years. The desktop UX is standardized. It's just like a steering wheel, and we don't change the steering wheel. And this is wrong on so many levels. I actually gave the closing keynote at Kai, which is one of the biggest UX conferences in the world. And I gave it on this very topic, basically showing that a steering wheel is not a standard. Not only has the steering wheel changed significantly and continues to change, it's actually it's like saying that the buggy whip was a standard. Well, yeah, it kind of sort of was, but it became useless because the car came along. And I think that in the case of the steering wheel, we're going to be getting electric bicycles and maybe self-driving cars. So the steering wheel is people knows what the platonic idea of a steering wheel is, but it won't matter over time. And so saying this means that the world is never going to change. And I think that's a very bad bet to take. No, I'm not trying to be a techno-utopian and saying we should jump on every single technological change. I think we should be slow and methodical. I'm just saying is that we just can't assume it's never going to change. And so innovation tends to melt our beliefs in stability. So these are the three traps we fall into. But now I want to talk about some potential directions, because there's just so much cool stuff happening right now. And I don't think we can count, as I said before, on the big guys to fast follow. There's deep productivity that we can unlock that would really allow us to use these technologies and fundamentally, change what we're capable of doing on the desktop. And I'm talking about things like large displays, and not just AR and VR displays, but just bigger displays and projection displays. And Windows systems right now just aren't really capable of handling them well. So there's also the idea of machine learning and large language model, which a lot of people are understandably very skeptical of. But what I love about LLMs right now is that the open source community is going to town, and they're figuring out ways to do ethical training. They're figuring out ways to completely do it locally so your privacy is maintained. They're even working on the energy consumption level. Now, they're not there yet, but they're making some great progress. So the potential for us to use it perfectly ethically with privacy-preserving ways seems something that's very, very close by. The next one I talk about is CRDTs, which are, if you're not familiar with it, is a very cool file format that allows you to buffer up every change made to a file. I did a project with Ink and Switch about 2 years ago where we built an open source version of Google Docs that didn't require a central storage server, which is really cool and preserved privacy and preserved your data and so forth. And the last one is just a better look at task and history. The best way to think about this is recall, which makes people get nervous. But all of your work, everything we do tends to get saved into a bunch of files. How you got there is lost. Now, on the flip side, we have our desktop environment, our virtual desktops, which is kind of like the shape of things that we do to get there. And that's nice. But we have nothing in between. And so to know what you did and how you did it would allow you to do similar tasks so much more easily. Or what was I doing when I was doing this? There's tremendous productivity gains by allowing the computer to help you go back in time and browse what you were doing. But of course, it has to be done well. Now, there's not going to be any quick wins today. That's not my point. My point, though, is that these are some really amazing things that I think that we could be looking at in an important way. So, but the point I guess I want to make, though, is vision is really easy and execution is hard. And so it's important for us to realize what we need to do for these things to really work. So the first thing I want to talk about is my last research project at Google. I left Google a couple of months ago, was a project called Eloquent. And it was looking at text editing on mobile, which was really a naive copy. I mean, even Apple did this. They just took what was done with desktop with a cursor, and they just blindly copied it over to the phone, and it's a disaster. And now everybody thought it was a standard. Everybody thought it was fine. Everybody thought there was nothing to do. And as I started doing more and more work in this, I realized it was a disaster. It was actually a very, very bad problem. And I was able to do some work. And it was very nuanced, subtle work. It took me many iterations to figure out what it was. And so what I'm basically trying to say is that great breakthroughs are multiple steps. And half of the problem is just defining it. And we have to take those steps to figure it out. And simplistic visions usually fail. So, and then one thing so for example, when we took apart Eloquent, we realized all of the problems came from people were multitasking a single click, and whether it meant to place your cursor, drag the cursor, or select the text. And we realized that we needed effectively a secondary technology to allow you to select something. And so we invented a new gesture that let you do that. And we wouldn't have discovered that if we hadn't done that previous work. So what I'm trying to just say here is sometimes you have to take a problem apart a little bit, and you do multiple little, scrums and multiple agile, things to figure it out. So what's really powerful, though, is the FOSS community, I believe, can build these correctly. We have a fundamentally different motivation. And so I think it gives us a huge leg up on these companies. Now, this is thinking longer term, but I do believe it's something that we should get started on now and figure out some way of doing this. There's a statement that is used by EMTs and firemen when they're in critical, crazy situations. They say, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And what they mean by that is that when you are slow and methodical, you can kind of go through a room and you can clear it out really clearly, and then that allows you to avoid a whole bunch of mistakes. So for us, thinking longer term and getting started on researching these things may feel slow, but it'll be smooth, and it allows us to explore these things in ways that are important to us and give us much better ideas of the kinds of things that we should be working on, so that we can kind of pick the right things and actually move much faster in the future. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if an awful lot of you now are just shaking your heads saying, what in hell are you thinking about, right? We are completely understaffed and underfunded. To do this kind of research seems completely pie in the sky. Well, yeah, I think you're right. But that's constraint-based thinking, right? So I'm just saying is that, okay, well, what's our goal? I mean, is this valuable? If we had a couple of projects that were looking at these things, understanding the technologies, figuring out how we might need to change the windowing system to make things drag better, would that be helpful? And how could we do that in a way that actually would be possible? So I think it's important for us to say, do we want this, right? And so where I'm inspired by this is by this company called Ink and Switch. I mentioned them before. I did a project for them. It's a nonprofit research open source organization. It started by the guys who founded Heroku, and they literally do a bunch of research, and it's all open sourced. And I think it's really, really an amazing organization. And I think we need to creatively steal their model. The idea is that you fund a few small teams, because so many people in this community have good ideas, but they can't afford to leave their day job to do it. And so if we gave them just a little bit of funding, they could take a few months off and basically do something and work on it nonstop. That would liberate, I think, so many people. And it would not cost a lot of money. Tight focus, 4-month projects, maybe a little longer. But the idea is that you don't boil the ocean. You pick some very specific topic and you work on it, and you try to figure out as much as you can in that short period of time and then pause. The idea is that you build a prototype roughly in 75% of the time, and the last 25% you write a paper. You don't write the paper the day before you're done, because, as I said before with my research, it's really hard to describe in detail what you're learning, what you uncovered. And that paper is critical, because the combination of these two things is a powerful way to magnify learning. Now, of course, all of this is open source, but the idea here is that, well, I'm suggesting, and I'm only suggesting this is not official in any way, but I'm trying to get people interested in this, is to start something called Gnome Labs, and people have wanted to do this kind of work. I am not asking for anything that many people in the audience have already wanted to do. The question is, let's start small with limited funding, do 2 or 3 of these small teams, do the prototype, do the paper, and just see how well it works. If we can make it work, if we can steal nicely, then we can maybe get more funding, get more of this started, and just build on that slowly over time. The idea is prove the concept, and then that way we're more cost effective, we're more focused, and hopefully much more collaborative. But the big advantage of this, the huge advantage, is that we create a template for funding. There is lots of funding out there, but it's shockingly hard to give to these individual projects. If we can kind of use the Gnome Foundation name and have a larger bucket of money to give, we can say, look at all these projects that you will get out of this, and it makes things so much easier to do. Now, we have to start small, of course, but I'm saying this is the longer term vision. But even better, because we're open source, I hope somebody creatively steals us, right? And like, maybe other Linux DEs can do this. Maybe the German government can do it. Maybe, who knows? There can be lots of other little labs popping up, and we can all build off of each other's work. That's kind of really what's unique about open source research. It's so open. So it's a bit sprawling. It might lack a little bit of control, but forking is encouraged. So you work on your little project for a while, and it might encourage somebody else to try something. So I feel this is a really unique way of doing research. It's very practical, but it's also radically open, and I think that has an awful lot of benefits. And the big thing is that we want to learn from others. So I want to stress, none of this work is mainline. No one wants to blow up your precious desktop right now. This is all meant to be prototypes. We'll play with it. And after a couple of rounds, if it's looking really good, we'll talk about bringing it in mainline. So here's the quick summary. And we want to avoid framing traps. Focus on goals, not constraints. APIs, not backend fixes. And try to avoid thinking things are a standard. There's so many possible directions we can explore. I gave you a couple. I'm not trying to say we should do all of them. I'm just saying there's some exciting things that we should be trying to work on. And the smart practical funding model is what Ink and Switch has already done. We're basically copying a model that has already worked really well. So that's really it. I just kind of wanted to give you this very fast 20-minute summary of this whole thing. I'll try taking some questions, but if we can't get to all of them, here I am in Mastodon, and here's my email address. And I really hope to continue this conversation with people afterwards. So please reach out to me. I'm very willing to chat. So that's it, and I'm ready to take questions. Yeah, it was just really weird talking to my screen. I just hope you guys got all that.
It was good. We are at time according to the schedule. We do have a 5-minute break starting right now before we have intern lightning talks. So if people want to hang around and come up and ask questions, we can keep that going. But we will try to keep the intern lightning talk starting on time as scheduled. Any questions in the room right now? Okay, can you come up? Oh yeah, sorry. If you're able, can you come up here so that Scott can also see and hear to answer a little more directly?
By the way, if you're in, also want to say, if you just throw things into the elements chat if we want, and I can chat with you guys afterwards too. Yes, please go ahead.
Ask into the computer.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for taking my question. I'm an I'm one of the organizers for Linux App Summit, and which is a conference that tries to build an app ecosystem on the Linux platform, and it has a whole bunch of stuff. One of the things that I know I have problems, and you talk about all those great possibilities of desktops, and Apple doesn't care about Mac OS and everything. I have found that when I go out and talk about, let's say, a desktop at Linux Foundation events or things like, there's an immediate lack of interest. Like, there's nothing interesting about desktops. And I've been struggling to figure out, how do I approach people to be interested in this topic when that is the immediate reaction. Like, somehow we're no longer important, even though as a group we have built so many things in that, but it's not recognized. And so I've actually been using App Ecosystem as a way to not use that. And I was just curious to see how would you start a conversation?
Well, all I can tell you is that, no, thanks for the question. That's excellent. All I'll tell you is it took me a very long time at Google to get people interested in mobile text editing, because everybody thought it was a done deal. It was totally boring. And so I feel your pain entirely. So I do believe that's actually a huge problem. All I can say is, I think if we just find a few small groups of people who are willing to tackle this problem, I'm hoping that the work will speak for itself, that people will understand, because the people that you're bumping into are the ones that say that the desktop is a standard, right? That it's never going to change. And that is such narrow thinking. And I don't think we're going to have a magic explanation to tell them that. I'm just hoping to find a little circle of people that believe that there's actually some magic left, and we actually go build it. And nothing kind of speaks than like results, because I agree with you. I don't think that there's these people, it's in their financial best interest probably just to not assume, and there's not much we can do about that. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to switch back to Matrix. See you guys. Bye.